Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. This is a schmooze day, so you never know what's going to happen. I do have two guests here who probably have something on their mind. Olivia Ward, who's here in Toronto. Olivia was, I got to know her when she was the foreign affairs columnist for the Toronto Star. But now she's gone on to higher things. She's making films. She tells me she's making films about the residential schools for the Indigenous children. Of course, a horrible, horrible, horrible story that we have going on here in Canada about finding graves of children who were not cared for properly in schools where they were forced to live. Anyway, that may not be what she wants to talk about, though. I'd be surprised if it were. In Washington, D.C., or in the vicinity, is Michael Beer. Michael works with all kinds of organizations doing nonviolence work in particular. And by the way, I don't know that you're all that affiliated with it, but I just learned last week that Peter Ackerman has died, and he was certainly a major figure in supporting the research and the actual activism of people working to use civil resistance rather than violence for whatever purposes. So give my condolences to all of you folks in the Washington, D.C. area, because you're going to definitely miss this man. Michael, how are you today, both of you? Olivia?
Very well, thank you.
Very good.
Nice to be with you and your viewers.
Nice to see you. And I also had a conversation with Mubarak Awad, by the way, and with one of your other colleagues last week about nonviolence. So today's a schmooze day. I don't know the origin of that word. I think it's a Yiddish word. Does anybody know what it came from?
Yes.
Is it Yiddish?
Yiddish. Mm-hmm. Yes, it is.
So, Olivia, why don't you tell us what you're thinking about these days?
Because of Michael's work, I'm very interested to ask him what he thinks because of this, the state of the world right now. And I have been through some nonviolent, quote, revolutions. And I've also been through some violent ones, but it's really hard to say from my perspective because I'm not immersed in the nonviolent community, and I've been to more wars than not. So I'm wondering, Michael, what do you think what is the role now for nonviolence if you want change? And I know that the stock answer is to say, well, it takes a lot longer, which is true. But is that possible these days? Because everything is so speeded up by the media, social media, the internet, everything happens so instantly now. So do people have the patience for nonviolence now? And given the incredible violence that we're seeing in not only in Ukraine, but in a lot of other places as well, what is the place for nonviolence?
I thank you for that perspicacious set of questions. I would first go to Dr. King's quote that we either have a choice between nonviolence and non-existence. Mm. And modern warfare is so horrifying and so destructive that it's like winning an earthquake, and with the prospect of nuclear weapons very much in the offing in the Ukraine conflict, we could be talking about existentially the extermination of humanity. And I know this sounds very over the top for a lot of people, but Meta Spencer's been on this for many, many decades, that we're living amidst thousands and thousands of nuclear weapons that are on hair trigger alert, and that are all of them many, many times more powerful than the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs. And we really can exterminate life as we know it on Earth through a series of mistakes and or actions that although unlikely, it would be just absolutely horrifying. So we really have an urgent need to end war, to really go after war as an institution. At Nonviolence International, we're very much focusing on those wars which engage, in which the neighbor believes that they should be acquiring the territory of that other territory. There are three major ones of this kind in the world today, and arguably there are a few others, but as far as the UN goes, there are three major ones. You have Russia invading and trying to occupy and annex parts of Ukraine. You have Israel occupying and trying to annex parts of Palestine and Syria, I mean the Golan Heights, and you have Morocco trying to occupy and annex the Western Sahara. So we're focused very much on these three. We believe that war will have a very difficult time moving forward if the world can just say no to territorial expansion by force. There are other reasons that wars happen that won't end all war, but that'll be a big, big step forward if the world can say no to grabbing territory by force. You do have the U.S. into Iraq and whatnot, which was essentially a resource grab rather than a territorial grab, because you're going after their oil fields. We do have civil wars in Lebanon, in Libya and in Yemen and other places that become proxy wars between states. So there's a lot of work to be done. But modern warfare is so destructive. You're seeing what's happening in Ukraine, where in the eastern part of Ukraine, modern artillery is so destructive that basically everything gets flattened. So at the end of this war, of course, a lot of people will be directly killed, but you're going to have massive, massive cities and infrastructure just leveled to the ground. And with lots of landmines left over and unexploded ordnance, and in the environmental damages from all of the chemical and petrochemical things that have been blown up and strewed all over the place. Modern warfare is just horrifying, and we have to make collectively as a world a much stronger attempt at limiting this, because ultimately we will be going towards nuclear weapons. We're already moving towards killer robots, which has horrifying kind of potential consequences. So that's kind of the bigger contextual kind of way forward. We do at Nonviolence International believe that nonviolence can be very powerful and is very powerful in opposing occupation, in opposing aggression and repression by governments. There's no guarantee that it will win. And there have been a lot of authoritarian and violence recently in which nonviolent movements have not won. But we're trying at the moment to be more practical here. We're issuing a report today on public opinion and anti-war messaging in Russia, and what kind of anti-war messaging we think will work. Because one of the ways to undermine this war is to undermine the Russian people's support of it. So that we think that's one way forward.
Right. And if I could cut in, I'm very interested in that because, of course, I've worked a lot in Russia, and I know how these things work. And you know, I've been through a couple of Russian wars of territory already. So this one is really unique because the messaging is so 100%. And you know, I know of, and I'm sure you do, of cases where people in Ukraine who are relatives of those in Russia have phoned them, and the relatives scream at them and hang up.
Yes.
They will not believe
That's
what their relatives are telling them from destroyed housing complexes and destroyed cities. So the challenge is absolutely enormous, because not only do you have complete and utter total messaging from the state or else, but you also have total repression, which is going more and more back to Stalinist times.
Totally
And people are very scared. So even as I'm sure Meta knows too, that even the polls that they take are really not accurate because because the people who are doing the polling are only allowed to use these ridiculous euphemisms, and they have to ask questions that are pitched to the propaganda of the Putin regime. So, if you call up somebody and say, are you against the fascism of Ukraine? Are you against the hegemony of NATO, which is encroaching on the territory of Russia, et cetera, et cetera? You're not going to get answers that say, no, I love it. So how do you...
I should have introduced you as somebody who had covered the war in Chechnya. And I wonder whether or not you saw anything comparable during that time. I thought it was pretty easy for journalists to report accurately on what was going on in Chechnya. And this is a different kettle of fish. Am I wrong?
Yeah, well, it was, and it was not, I would say, totally easy. I mean, apart from the obvious, being caught by bombs and artillery and stuff, but it also had some risks, particularly in the Putin era, and that's one reason why my former reporting colleague Anna Politkovskaya was murdered, and a lot of other people were murdered. There was a young Czech woman who was murdered much earlier. Mm-hmm. And she was just killed on the road because they knew she was a reporter. So there was that. But generally speaking, especially in the first war, which was a very disordered kind of war, it was the Yeltsin regime that was doing it. Some of the same characters were around, but basically Yeltsin didn't have much control over anything, and the military was going off in all directions. So it was a very different kind of war. But what I saw that was interesting and sometimes actually amusing for some of the Western reporters was that there were these very brave and bold and determined Russian reporters who were going out and reporting stuff on camera, not just in newspapers. And one of their tactics that I just loved was they would pretend to their news desks that they were right in the middle of something and they couldn't file until the very last minute. So there wasn't official censorship because, under cover of war, they were saying you can't do this or that. But they would wait until the very last minute, and then they'd put across a blast of news showing what was actually happening on the ground and not being the slightest bit, flattering to the Russian troops. So this certainly does not happen anymore because Putin has systematically, as you know, taken control of all the media. Mm-hmm. There is now no media that is freely able to report from Russia on any mainstream way. And of course, there are people who are trying that channels and they have a certain audience. But for somebody who is in Novosibirsk, they have no idea. They're watching Russian state TV and Russia's other state TV channels. Mm-hmm. And they probably don't even read papers, but if they did, they'd get the same. So Michael, how do you get around that?
Yeah, good question.
Right. Well, yeah, that's a tall order. Obviously, the Putin regime, as you know better than I, has become a near totalitarian one. Mm-hmm. And control of the media is the mainstream media anyway, is an enormously powerful tool. Luckily, we have the internet now, and we didn't have that back in the Soviet Union era, for example, or in previous generations, so that there is a significant communication by either telephone or by internet, one-to-one, not generally mass communication that can spread news, and that's how information is being spread. We do know that social distance does matter. When you look at the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender revolutions around the world and how dramatically quick and fast that has occurred, a lot of this has been attributed to the fact that people in one's family or among one's close friends happens to know somebody who came out as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender, and that this had just a dramatic impact on public opinion over a very short time. And so social distance does matter. And these people that do call into family members and friends in Russia and get hung up and whatnot, I mean, it is significant phenomena. And there's no guarantee. We all know plenty of siblings that don't get along and don't listen to each other. But social distance does matter. And if you're in Novosibirsk and your friend's son just got killed and is coming back in a coffin, or not even coming back in a coffin because the Russian government doesn't even deem it important to send the body back. This is social distance. This is likely to have an impact. At least we hope so. I know Meta's been very concerned over many years now that we have many people and groups around the world that believe in conspiracy theories and believe what governments or some industries tell them to believe, that are just completely contrary to common sense or science. And this can happen to be with climate change, or can happen to be with vaccines, or all kinds of things. We have a collective need in this world to try to really figure out how to manage this problem. I don't have a magic solution for this. And one idea I have for the United States, which I don't know will work well for the world, but for the last 150, 200 years, most of the discussions in our society have been mediated by professionals. And these discussions have been mediated primarily through what we call journalists or mainstream media. And we have really lost a lot of the professional mediators, and not just mediators, but facilitators, perhaps is a better word, who facilitated conversations in the community, would weed out facts from fiction, and would help people communicate. And we've lost the hometown newspapers. We've lost the investigative reporters in the United States. We've lost these people who facilitate these conversations. And I'm thinking that couldn't we come up with a small little tax of 1 penny for every cell phone account or internet account that would then go to help pay for local and professional facilitators or journalists who could help our society better weed through the morass of disinformation and dangerous ideas that are floating around and causing so many problems.
Yeah, no, I think that's a wonderful idea, and it's being mooted in different forms, but a sort of tax on, this or that, and it's a very good idea, and I am very concerned about the loss of what you might call small town reporting, and in fact regional reporting. It's really terrible. And in fact, as a good example, I have a friend who is a brilliant investigative reporter who's based in Arizona. And he has reported some hair-raising stories that he's researched at tremendous risk to himself. And he's presented them to, he wants them in local papers, statewide. And he's had almost no success with that, because the ones that exist are terrified, because they're only supported basically by advertising. And the advertisers usually go back to some of the people that he's reporting about. So that's squelched. And then I've told him many times, you've got to go to the Washington Post, New York Times, et cetera, et cetera. But then the problem with that is that they have their own squad of reporters. So they might take an idea, but then they'll send out people to do it. So it's very, very, very difficult for people, even people who are really good reporters on the scene, to get any kind of foothold. And I think your idea and some that are aligned with it would be a huge help.
I do think this is a global problem. And of course, a lot of countries like Russia are also, you add in the lack of hometown newspapers and reporters to this whole issue of state terror. And I think terror is not understatement now. They're really using very, very aggressive repression. But the upside for nonviolence as a tool to move forward is that nonviolence in many cases involves disruption. And we're an increasingly interconnected world. And with an increasingly interconnected world, it actually provides more and more options for disruption because we are so connected. And so we have hope, and we're working at Nonviolence International to work with the professionals in Russia, to work with the young people in Russia, to work with certain segments of ethnic minorities in Russia, to work with others to see what we can do to ramp up the anti-war messaging so that this war ends.
Well, Michael, I'm sorry to cut in again, but what I'm interested in is, how do you reach these people? Because everything now, as you say, it's almost a totalitarian society now, and there is a lot of fear, and the penalties for going against the Putin regime are getting worse and worse, as Meta knows too. So, first of all, how can you reach them? And secondly, once you do reach them, how can you convince them that it's worth the risk?
Yes, well, that's a great question. I'm not sure I have all the answers to that, but these are great questions.
Let me offer this, because Sunday we had the Global Town Hall monthly, and usually I have somebody from Ukraine and somebody from Russia. One young man from Russia is very bold, and I asked him many questions like this. I worry about even having him appear on a talk show on Zoom, which was posted on YouTube. But apparently he says that they did enact this law, which is, I think they're charging people a $500 fine for trivial matters now, but theoretically they could be sent to prison for 15 years. And I suppose some of them are, if they use the word war, or, when they're not supposed to, or something like that. But I was asking him, how much we're putting him in danger by having him appear on the show, because I love to have his comments, but I also worry about putting him at risk. Well, he says that although they were enforcing the laws pretty rigorously for a month or two, he says that he doesn't think they're doing it quite as much for the last, I don't know when, he didn't put a time interval on it, but he thinks that lately they're not being as rigorous about enforcement. So it's not quite as risky as it was, but he says that most people simply avoid the subject because it is so fraught. If you talk with somebody, you don't know whether they're going to get agitated in defending Putin or what. But I think that you can use YouTube, and he says you can use phones. He doesn't think that he doesn't know of anybody being prosecuted or arrested for saying things on the phone, because it's supposedly anything you say in public that can be held against you. So if you talk to people privately, you still may be in trouble because they may get upset because they take one side or the other. So there are many hurt feelings and broken friendships, but there are apparently ways if you dare to call somebody and see whether they hang up on you or scream at you, then at any rate, don't, you can do it probably without putting them at risk. If you're just talking about the phone or something like that.
Right. But I think too that one of the problems is that it's really a matter, I think, of triggering. That is, and I'm thinking particularly of one kind of outlet, Michael, that I was thinking was probably one of the last bastions, maybe, of freedom, of resistance in Russia, and that is the families of soldiers who've died. Because in the Chechen wars, the soldiers' mothers, as you know, and I knew quite a few of them, were a huge force, and they helped to end basically the first war. The second war was Putin's war, and that was not possible. But they still came out and protested, and they became a force. Now they're still among themselves. They're still reporting about their sons who were killed, and they're trying to figure out what to do. And the Soldiers' Mothers Committee is operating, but I think it's allowed to operate because they're not out on the streets. So I think the problem is once things do go public, as you say, that's when the problem begins. And if I was hoping that, there'd be a big groundswell because people who've lost sons in this war would start talking to their friends and their neighbors and saying, do you know what's going on?
But Olivia, are you saying that you're sure that the Mothers of Soldiers that committee is still functioning? Because totally. I'd heard that their office was closed down anyway, and maybe they're
it had been. It's a strange thing that it was closed down very early, but then they kind of let it go. Uh-huh. And they have a small office in Moscow, I think, rather than, and they may have one in Petersburg as well, but they have an office in Moscow that's simply overrun. And they have people on the phones that, are like talking to people 24 hours a day, desperate parents who want to know, because they've become a clearinghouse for information. And the regime doesn't seem to want to touch them at this minute, because as long as the information, I guess, is just circulating among grieving parents and nothing is said about it outside of that, I suppose they don't care. But if this becomes a groundswell, there's going to be a big crackdown, and it will not look good to have the Oman beating and dragging off grieving parents.
Yeah. Well, now that's the reason he said why they're not sending bodies home in coffins, or maybe they send a few, but he says that they have a mobile crematorium, and that and a lot of the Ukrainians in Ukraine, seeing what they're doing, are shocked that they show so little respect for the corpses of the soldiers. They just dispose of them, and there's nothing going to go home.
And some of them are not even disposed of. They're just left out in the open to be dragged apart by animals and decay into the ground. But at the very, very beginning of this war, the military made a rule that it was possible, instead of sending bodies home, it was possible to have mass burials wherever, I guess, they were killed, like in the first battle it wasn't much of a battle because the Russians were decimated, but hundreds of them were lost in that push toward Kiev, which they gave up. And I would think that a lot of those people who died, who were basically incinerated in their tanks, will never come home. I think they'd be in mass graves.
Yeah. Okay. So at least are they informing the parents? Your son is not coming home.
They're not. They're in only in some cases are they informing the parents, and I'm not sure how they discriminate with that, but mostly I think what they do, and I don't have any direct contact with people on this, but I believe mostly what they're doing is what they've done in the past, which is to say, oh, your son, you haven't heard from your son, for so many weeks. Well, don't worry about it. He's on maneuvers, and there's a lot of secrecy, and you can't get too worried about that. Or if the son is seen to be missing, it's, well, he's probably with another unit, or he's gone off somewhere, but he'll be picked up by the troops, or something
These
like
soldiers
that.
presumably are carrying their own cell phones. I
That's
haven't
right.
heard anybody say
Yes.
what happens. Can they, if they're sitting in their tank, can they call home?
Well, sometimes they can. It just depends on what the signal is like, and if they're able to keep their phone, because as you know, the rule was you have to give up your phone, because they didn't trust, as usual, they don't trust the troops at all. They're just cannon fodder. So, and a lot of people had deserted, over time. So they don't really trust them. And they may have said, you can't use your phone, or you've got to hand in your phone, or whatever. But I think that it's so chaotic that I would be very surprised if they can really enforce that. I mean, I guess that they'd have to rely on the unit, the people who are the unit leaders, to actually go from, one person to one recruit to the other, and see whether they have phones, or get people to rat each other out or something. But yeah, no, they do get back. You see, the problem is that once those soldiers tell their parents what's going on, the parents are now officially not allowed to say anything. This is part of the repression. They're not allowed to talk to anyone outside of the direct family. So
it's astounding. That
it is
really, that would be hard to enforce. Boy, I mean, a grieving mother who wants to tell her neighbor, and
Yeah.
she's not allowed.
But the thing is, there, because of this very Stalinist fear, I mean, and again, I don't know, because I haven't talked to people who are basically out in the provinces who've lost their sons. But if they do talk to their neighbors, are their neighbors going to rat on them? Because maybe the neighbor is really, quote, patriotic, or sees it as a war, for an existential war that NATO is fighting against Russia. And so they think, oh, so this, they don't doubt that the neighbors lost a son, but they're saying to each other, well, they're traitors because the son has died for Russia, and here they are complaining. So they could.
This is, you're saying they passed a real law saying that they're not allowed, the parents.
Yes, well, I'm not sure, to be honest, I'm not sure whether it's a law or whether it's a rule made by the military itself. But at any rate, it is forbidden for them to talk about their sons, anything to do with their sons, including their death. Well,
if that's true, that's going to affect what Michael's doing. I presume a lot of your energy is going to be focused on how to communicate with the people who are most affected by the deaths in the war, and how to help them, communicate their feelings and their objections.
Mm-hmm.
Right, Michael?
Yes. I think there are enormous repression, but there are enormous opportunities here. I think Russian society is in very, very desperate shape. I think many Russians see that there is desperate situation. The economic sanctions from the world are significant and severe, and will have increasingly important impact. There's been a huge brain drain of some of the best and the brightest who have left Russia in the last 3-4 months. And when it comes to people losing their children, they're pretty. It's pretty hard for even a repressive state to completely stop them from organizing or doing something to try to meet their needs. So we're hopeful. There have been a lot of examples of nonviolent resistance from the beginning in Russia. Of course, these things generally happen in kind of two ways. They happen at the individual level, which we're encouraging a great deal of, the individual phone calls, the individual emails, individual communications. And a lot of this is going to happen despite the repression of the state. And then, and part of this is survival, economic survival, survival of the family. They're really pushing this. The next level is organizing and getting groups together, whether it's the groups of the mothers or other kinds of groups together, to really start organizing in a significant way. And this is what the regime is particularly afraid of. Generally, summertime is, in Russia in particular, northern country, is a time when people are outside, and it's a lot easier. If you're going to see protests come up, where you have people manifesting themselves in the streets, it's likely that this is the time of year when that's more plausible to happen. So we'll see. We'll obviously be encouraging that in whatever way we can. So I just finally, I want to toot my own horn here. I've written a book recently called Civil Resistance Tactics of the 21st Century, which outlines the 350 tactics, nonviolent tactics that we've gathered throughout the world that have been used in nonviolent struggles, and the number keeps growing. We have a tactics database too that you can find through Nonviolence International. And we want to encourage the Russian people, the Ukrainian people, and people around the world to realize that the toolbox of nonviolent resistance is huge. There are huge variety of things that can be done in different situations. And we encourage people to read the book, to come to our database, and not be defeated by terror and despair, but to try to be creative and try to come up with things that you can do and ways that you can organize with others to meet your needs.
Great. I'd love to read that.
Mm-hmm. Tell us, give us some little excerpts.
Sure. Well, there are fabulously huge number of ways that people can resist. One big category is what people say or what people communicate. And so there are lots of ways that people communicate through arts, through video, through writing and whatnot about how they feel. And so people are just endlessly creative in terms of how they express themselves. Another set of kind of nonviolent tactics are those in which people refuse to cooperate. These can be often done individually and sometimes at less risk. So, for example, strikes are a form of refusing to sell your labor. You refuse to work the way the company or whoever wants you to work. Or, there are all kinds of different strikes. You can do little go slow strikes where you follow the letter of the law and you don't do anything more than you need to do. So you just do a minimalist job. They can't fire you, but you're just barely getting the job done. They're all different kinds of strikes that are very, very powerful. There's also boycotts, which is another kind of non-cooperation, which is the refusal to buy things. And they're just an enormous different range of these kinds of things can be done. Finally, there's a big category of what we call interventions, where people literally take over police stations, or they take over a cultural institution, or they start up a medical clinic because there isn't one and the government isn't providing it, or they start up their own newspaper, or they start up their own police force, or their own court system, or there are lots and lots of ways in which people can directly usurp power when the government is absent or not doing its job.
I remember
finally,
that connection, some of the things that the Poles did in under Solidarność. I mean, they were so creative in thinking of things to do. Like they made their own postage stamps, and the people in the post office would honor them and deliver the mail, and they had their own university in people's homes and talked about things that we're not allowed to talk about in real universities and so on. I think, I love the idea of just playing with the alternative things you can create that show up the official institutions as inadequate or stupid.
Well, one of my friends has written a book that, I've sort of followed through over 3 years of really difficult labor. But anyway, it's about if women took over the world. And now this is not exactly a perfect equation as we know, but I'm afraid this is a spoiler, but she has it all leading up to the women of the world becoming so, first of all, interconnected in their hatred of violence, which is mainly perpetrated by men. So they in countries all over the world, they have these sort of wildcat strikes where women literally sit down, and in towns and villages and cities, they say to their male counterparts, well, I'm not going to do the cooking. I'm not looking after the kids. So I'll just hand them over to you and you can look after them. And from now on, until we get our way, which is basically nonviolence and electing women to office where they can have control, until we get our way, we're just not doing anything. And you guys just take over, enjoy it.
Well, of course, the classic thing in that account was Lysistrata.
Exactly.
They went on a sex strike
on a huge scale.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. Okay. I love the idea, but back to Michael, who may not enjoy the thought so much.
Well, as I say, it's not a perfect equation. I mean, there are women who, for instance, in the anti-abortion movement,
there
are lots of women, but generally speaking, if you look at the history of the world down, to now, usually the most serious and damaging wars and threats to the world's well-being and survival have been perpetrated mainly by men.
Well, that's certainly true, but we could have a different conversation about that because so much of the feminist movement consists of protests demanding the right to be on the same scale of belligerence in the military as
I know. It makes me slap my forehead because have they ever been to a war?
Yeah, I'd like to ask Michael about the content of the messaging, because I think that, really, to me, one of the interesting questions when it's a matter of trying to be persuasive rhetorically, with people that may not necessarily agree with you or may not be ready to say so, is how to frame the conversation in a productive way so that they're more likely to join in. I'm thinking, for example, of the question of shame, because, a lot of peace activism now says, well, we don't have any weapons that we can use to stop the war, but we can resort to shaming people who fight. And I'm really ambivalent about whether or not shame is a good tool, or whether by humiliating your opponent, you just make it more difficult for them to come around. Do you cover that kind of issue, Michael, in deciding how to communicate best with the people you're trying to persuade and to bring into some sort of mobilization?
Yeah, our report that comes out today, it talks about the fact that humiliation and shame are probably not going to be very effective for big chunks of the Russian population.
Oh, no. Right.
And they're very strongly nationalist, and they have pride. And the idea that, you accuse people of being, when you do go beyond just attacking the state and the Putin state, but you basically attack the character of the Russian people, et cetera, et cetera. This is not going to be very productive in many cases. And there can be some cases when you have socially tight neighborhoods, maybe a sibling or a family member or somebody who's close. Shame can have more of an impact when you have very close social distance. But we're generally proposing that people use fairly positive messaging for, that the future can be different, the future can be better than what we're doing right now, particularly reaching out to youth. We don't have to go down this path. Russia deserves better. We can have so much better future. And so I'm glad you brought up this shaming issue, because it's not likely to be a very useful way to change public opinion.
And the other thing too, Michael, is, as you know, that the sad thing is that the people at the top have no shame.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So it's quite useless to try and shame them. And it's the people down the ladder who, I think you're quite right. It's only going to inflame them. It's not going to put them on your side.
So we have 4 recommendations. I'll just briefly mention them to you. Willingness to accept various options for a peace agreement. The public wants peace, but not defeat.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea that you're going to be trying to do a messaging that talking about the defeat of the Russian people or the government is not likely to work well.
Mm-hmm.
So we do need to be encouraging peace agreements because there has to be a negotiated outcome of this. It's not going to be a military victory that's going to determine this outcome. It's going to be a peace agreement of some sort. And we need to be getting people ready for some sort of peace agreement. Mass mobilization and reformatting of special operation into an open war. What do we mean by that? The mass mobilization is something that will happen in Russia if the Putin regime really feels scared.
Mm-hmm.
And right now it's limited mobilization. If they do go to mass mobilization, we want to do messaging now for people to undermine the massive mobilization.
Mm-hmm.
If people really massively resist the draft and massively non-cooperate, we think that this has a possibility to prevent escalation of the war to go further. And a third recommendation here is around escalation of the conflict. Opening a war front with a NATO country, despite the seeming absurdity of this expansion, there are a number of reasons why the Russian leadership may really escalate in this way, because they need to turn this into a kind of a Russia versus NATO kind of thing. So we need to do all kinds of messaging to prevent this from, to the best of our ability, from expanding to becoming kind of a NATO, giving Putin the justification, say, oh, this is the whole NATO world is against us. I mean, he's doing it already. But so there are some things that we're looking ahead to that we think we can try to emphasize now to try to prevent mass mobilization and try to prevent attacking a NATO country.
But Michael, that I thought your recommendations were all aimed at the Russian population, but this latter one would be aimed at NATO people, at us.
Well, it's true. It could be both in that case. Yes. In my view, I believe that the United States could have prevented this war or can end this war if we wanted to. Of course, I have a very unusual proposition, but I would like the United States to say that we will withdraw our 75-year occupation of Europe with our troops in Europe. We will withdraw from Europe if Russia withdraws from its these territories in Ukraine and Transnistria and neighboring countries. And I think that this might be a way out for Russia and a way out of the United States from being in perpetual troops overseas in Europe.
I would go for that, but it's not going to win you any friends in Europe, because all these people like Finland and Sweden are joining precisely so they can get more support from everybody else, including the US. So
I think European unity and security is important, and there is an enormous amount of unity and security in Europe. They're more than sufficient in protecting themselves. And yes, I mean, there's risks to everything, but I think that we need a new world order that it's not based on the U.S. being the police of the world with 800 military bases around the world. And we need to be moving to a new security architecture in the world in which the United States is not in this forward posture and playing these geopolitical games with the big powers. And in my view, some sort of arrangement here, we could really help peace come if the United States was willing to make some serious changes to the way that we helped build security around the world. And that's my very specific suggestion for the current crisis in Ukraine. I think Russia's going to need help, and Ukraine are going to need help to get to peace. There are big European sanctions on Russia and whatnot. And I think it's going to be a collective effort to bring peace there. And I'm hoping that we could also contribute concessions to help make peace happen.
When you look at the Ukraine war, you have to see the misconception that it is NATO as the cause of this war. It is not. Actually, if you want to go to a cause, it is actually the European Union. Because, as you know, what began this smoldering conflagration was the Maidan Revolution, which overthrew Yanukovych, who was actually very corrupt, and he was known to be a thug. And he was also more or less on Moscow's side. I mean, he did try to play both sides of the road, but when push came to shove, he realized that I hate to keep on with these horrible metaphors, but his bread was buttered on the Russian side. So that's what he went for.
That's true. It's true.
Yeah. So the Maidan Revolution took place because the majority of Ukrainians saw themselves as Europeans.
Yes.
And Ukraine was becoming more and more European. I mean, as many people have said, when you walk down the street in Kiev and a lot of other cities, you find very little difference from some of the European cities. And that's what people aspired to. And that is why, I mean, it wasn't simply because they were tremendous flag-waving Europhiles. It was that they could see their future as being part of Europe, which would help them economically, would give them more opportunity, and their children, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what happened.
But how does that mean that the EU is to blame then?
The EU is not to blame at all.
I thought you said the EU was responsible.
No, I said it's wrong to say that NATO is to blame. The core of this is not NATO, it is the EU. But it's not hegemony by the EU, far from it. It's that Ukrainians went and knocked on the door of the EU.
Right.
And said, we'd really like to come in. And the EU was not totally, at that point, wasn't all that excited about it because they had to meet a lot of benchmarks. Mm-hmm. So, you know, as they do with every country that knocks on the door.
Well, yeah, but would you say that if the EU had allowed Ukraine in, early on, that this whole thing wouldn't have happened?
Oh, absolutely not. I mean, if the EU had let Ukraine in, it would have happened earlier.
Okay. That's
Yeah,
why I
no,
was
no.
puzzled,
Right.
No, it's just that is what began the violent annexation of Crimea, although it's characterized as a very quiet thing, but it wasn't. It was quite violent, and also, especially for people like the Tatars. But then, of course, it went straight very quickly into eastern Ukraine, and covert actions taking place in eastern Ukraine. They did have a number of disgruntled people who were Russian speakers, but those Russian speakers were not the subject of genocide. They wanted more rights, and that's fine. They could have been perhaps granted more autonomy, and perhaps that would have helped. But Russia rushed in, and they had their troops there. They had weaponry coming in. They had money coming in. They started giving people Russian passports. They did everything possible to split off that area, and in fact to make Ukraine a non-viable state and not able to join the European Union. So really, that was the crux of it.
Absolutely. I agree with this.
Yeah, and nothing. Yeah, and nothing.
And I do think, however, there is also a big power game mentality that does go on with the Chinese and the Russians and the Americans and others and the Europeans that does inform the larger picture here. The United States is very unhappy that Russia is invading Ukraine, but it's been a huge supporter of Israel and its occupations of Palestine and Syria, and very supportive and encouraging of Moroccans to occupy their neighbors. And so it's not like there's some sort of United States or other countries is operating purely from a principle of international law and all this stuff. There is a big power game element to this that very much drives Putin and the Russians in their brain as well. And I think that the United States could make a contribution to contributing to a peace agreement if we were willing to make concessions and along the lines that I've talked about in terms of having our troops remain in Europe. I think this could be a way for Putin to be able to sell to his people, see, I've gotten concessions for this war, et cetera, et cetera. We've not lost this war completely. We've gotten big concessions from the United States to withdraw from Europe. So this would be, and I, as an American, U.S. citizen, I don't want the U.S. to be perpetually the police of the world. I think it's going to be valuable for the world to move carefully towards a new security architecture. It's going to be challenging. I think, if anything, Europe is going to be more united now and able to handle its security needs without the direct support of the United States. And so I'm just throwing out there that peace is going to need to come, and everybody's going to need to contribute to helping make peace.
Our time is up, and it's been extremely interesting and valuable. And let's hope that some of it reaches Russia, because that would be the place where it might have a real impact. Don't you think?
Yeah.
It's a great honor to speak with both you, and Olivia, you are just a spectacular font of knowledge and wisdom on Russia and Ukraine. It's been a great pleasure talking with you today.
Well, we want to thank Nonviolence International for keeping you busy, because you're doing good work. All right. Yep. Thank you both. It's been lovely, and take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Project Save the World produces one of these shows 3 days a week, sometimes more. This is episode number 459. You can watch them or listen to them as audio podcasts on our website, tosavetheworld.ca. Eventually, we even post the transcripts there. When you get to the website, look around, because we have conversations going on all the time about 6 global issues, plus potential reforms in governance, economics, and civil society. To find a particular talk show, Enter its title or episode number in the search bar, or the name of one of the guest speakers. After you've watched or listened, scroll down and share your own thoughts about the show. This is a place for dialogue, so join in. Project Save the World also produces a quarterly online publication, Peace Magazine. You can buy a single copy or subscribe for $20 Canadian per year through Press Reader. Just go to pressreader.com on your browser, and in the search bar, enter the word peace. You'll see the cover of the current issue and buttons to click to subscribe.